They chose her over me, and now they're begging for my help. The words taste bitter as I say them aloud, echoing in the quiet solitude of my apartment. How do you even begin to process something like this? One moment, I was a teenager standing on the threshold of adulthood, full of dreams and determination, and the next, I was abandoned, cast out by the very people who were supposed to guide me. My parents didn't just kick me out, they made it clear that I wasn't worth their time or money. Yet here we are, years later, with them pleading for my assistance after lavishing resources on my younger sister Clara for decades. It's not easy to reconcile the anger I still carry with the guilt of seeing them now, frail, desperate, and humbled by circumstances beyond their control. But every time I look at them, all I can see is the night they told me to leave. To understand how deeply this betrayal cut, you need to know what our family once meant to me. Growing up, I idolized my parents, or at least the version of them I believed in. My father, Marcus, was a stern but fair man who worked tirelessly to provide for us. My mother, Evelyn, was warm and nurturing, always ready with a plate of cookies or a comforting word when life got tough. Together, they created a home filled with laughter, discipline, and love, or so I thought. Claire and I had a bond too, one built on sibling rivalry, but also mutual respect. She was the dreamer, always sketching designs in her notebook and talking about becoming a fashion designer. I was the planner, mapping out my future step by step, determined to make something of myself. We dreamed big together, imagining a world where she'd own her boutique, and I'd run a successful tech startup. Those dreams felt attainable back then, rooted in the belief that our family would support us equally. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Clara was their golden child, the one who could do no wrong. As I grew older, I noticed how quickly they dismissed my achievements compared to hers. Still, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I had plans, goals, and a determination to prove them wrong. Looking back now, the warning signs were there if I'd only paid attention. There were whispers about investments my parents made on Clara's behalf, private art classes, expensive materials, trips abroad for inspiration. Meanwhile, I scraped by, working part-time jobs to cover expenses they promised would be taken care of. When I asked about the discrepancies, they waved me off saying, "Don't worry about it. Focus on your studies." I should have seen it coming, should have realized how far they'd go to ensure Clara's success at my expense. But denial is a powerful thing. I told myself it was temporary, that they'd come through eventually. Instead, I found myself standing in the doorway of our house at 18, suitcase in hand, as my father handed me a check for $500 and said, "You're an adult now, figure it out." The sting of rejection burned hotter than I ever imagined. That check barely covered a month's rent, let alone tuition or groceries. Every dollar I earned afterward felt like a reminder of what had been stolen from me. If you're invested in this story and want to find out how I navigated the aftermath of being cast aside, and whether I'll forgive my parents for their betrayal, don't forget to hit that like button below. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or predictions. I'd love to hear what you think will happen next. And make sure to subscribe for more emotionally gripping tales like this one. The months following my eviction were a blur of survival and self-discovery. Sleeping on friends' couches became routine, though the nights were long and restless. Mornings were worse, waking up disoriented, staring at unfamiliar ceilings, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Pride kept me from reaching out to anyone for help, even when desperation clawed at my chest. Work became my lifeline. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could. Deliveries, janitorial shifts, anything to scrape together enough cash for food and gas. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Eventually, I landed a stable job at a tech company, pouring every ounce of energy into climbing the ranks. Each promotion felt like a victory against the odds, proof that I didn't need my family to succeed. Meanwhile, glimpses of Clara's privileged life fueled my resentment. Social media painted a picture-perfect existence. Photos of her attending exclusive design shows, traveling the world, living the dream I'd worked so hard for. Her captions were filled with gratitude toward our parents, oblivious to the sacrifices I'd made for her benefit. Did she even realize the cost of her success? One evening, as I sat in my tiny studio apartment eating instant noodles, guilt crept in. Was I becoming consumed by bitterness? Revenge wouldn't bring back what I'd lost, but forgiveness felt impossible. For too long, I'd been the victim, the forgotten child. Now it was time to take back control, not of my family, but of myself. Years passed, and though I built a successful career, the emotional scars remained. Visits home were rare, strained affairs filled with awkward silences and forced pleasantries. Clara tried to bridge the gap between us, inviting me to holidays and family gatherings, but the resentment lingered beneath the surface. Our parents avoided discussing the past, acting as though nothing had happened, while Clara tiptoed around the subject, unsure of how to mend what had broken. Then came the call that shattered the fragile peace. Clara's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Mom and Dad, they're struggling," she admitted, her tone heavy with guilt. "Dad's health is failing, and Mom can't manage everything on her own. They've been calling me nonstop, asking for help." My stomach churned at her words. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked sharply, though I already knew the answer. "They want to reach out to you," she replied softly. "They know they messed up, and they're scared. Please, just hear them out." Her plea caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to hang up, to shut them out completely. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, wondered if this was my chance to confront the pain I'd buried for so long. When I finally agreed to visit, the tension was palpable. My father sat slumped in his recliner, his once imposing frame diminished by illness. My mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands nervously. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then, haltingly, my father began to apologize. "We were wrong," he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. "About so many things. About you. About Clara. We let pride get in the way. And now we may not have the chance to make it right." His admission stunned me. This wasn't the man I remembered, the one who had stood firm in his convictions, refusing to budge even an inch. This was someone broken, humbled by illness and regret. As much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, to cling to the narrative I'd built around him, it was hard to deny the sincerity in his voice. But forgiveness isn't something I could offer lightly, not after everything. So instead, I changed the subject, focusing on practical matters. "What happens next?" I asked. "What does the doctor say?" My mother answered, explaining the prognosis and treatment options, though none of it sounded promising. By the time I left the house later that evening, my head was spinning with questions I didn't know how to answer. Was I really willing to put aside years of resentment for the sake of reconciliation? And if I did, what would that mean for Clara and me? During one of my visits, Clara pulled me aside, her expression uneasy. "There's something you need to know," she said quietly. "Something about why Mom and Dad treated you the way they did." Her words sent a jolt through me. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated before continuing. "They weren't just favoring me because they loved me more. They were scared of losing you." "Scared?" I echoed, incredulous. "How does kicking me out make sense if they were scared?" "They thought pushing you away would force you to be independent," she explained, tears welling in her eyes. "They saw how driven you were, how ambitious, and they feared you'd resent them for holding you back. So they pushed you harder than they should have, thinking it was for your own good." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. All these years, I'd assumed their actions stemmed from indifference or cruelty, but hearing Clara's explanation forced me to reconsider everything. Had they truly believed they were helping me, even as they destroyed our relationship? As much as I wanted to dismiss her words, I couldn't ignore the truth behind them. My parents' methods had been misguided, damaging, but perhaps not entirely malicious. The realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened the edges, making room for understanding, if not yet forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, I found myself spending more time with my parents, helping them navigate the challenges of my father's declining health. It wasn't easy. Old wounds reopened with every interaction, but slowly, incrementally, we began to rebuild trust. Conversations shifted from superficial updates to deeper reflections on the past, each admission bringing us closer to closure. Clara played a crucial role in bridging the gap, organizing family dinners and encouraging open dialogue. Watching her advocate for reconciliation reminded me of the bond we once shared, untainted by jealousy or resentment. Through her efforts, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing their mistakes. It was about choosing to move forward, even when it was hard. By the time my father passed away peacefully, surrounded by family, I felt a profound sense of peace. Though the road to healing had been long and fraught with obstacles, it had ultimately led me to a place of acceptance. Love, I learned, isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes devastating, but it's also resilient. And if nurtured with honesty and effort, it can overcome even the deepest wounds. Years later, as I watched Clara laugh with her children during a summer barbecue, I reflected on how far we'd come. My parents' choices had shaped me in ways I never anticipated, teaching me the value of independence, resilience, and self-worth. Though they hadn't lived to see the full extent of my success, their legacy lived on, not in the material wealth they provided Clara, but in the lessons they inadvertently taught me. Life taught me that forgiveness isn't a gift you give others, it's a gift you give yourself. By choosing to let go of bitterness, I found freedom, and in doing so, I discovered what it truly means to belong.